Have you ever worked in a team where something went wrong? Someone was struggling, a mistake was made, the pressure was high, and you could feel the difference between a team where individuals close ranks and blame and a team that leans in and supports each other. Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Today on Compassion in a T-shirt, we're exploring compassion at work. Not just as an individual trait, but as something that can live, breathe, and operate at the level of teams and whole organisations. I'm joined by Professor Helena Nguyen, whose work sits at the forefront of research on workplace compassion. In a recent special issue examining compassion in organisations across individuals, teams and systems, Helena and her colleagues make a compelling case that compassion isn't just a nice to have, it's a strategic necessity. It shapes psychological safety, well-being, learning and even outcomes like patient safety in healthcare. In this conversation, we unpack what team-level compassion actually looks like, how mindfulness supports it, what gets in the way, and why this work matters now more than ever. And so I bring you Professor Helena Nguyen. Professor Helena Nguyen, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you. There's been a big rise in interest in compassion at work, I guess, over the last few decades. From your perspective, what's driving that, and why does compassion feel especially important, I guess, for organisations right now?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. There's been a few factors, I'd say, that's contributed to the interest in compassion over the last, say, decade or so. I might go through some of them. I think firstly, because I'm a work psychologist and I do research in organizational behavior, I think the landscape of work has changed so much. And by that, I mean it's become faster, leaner, flatter. If you think about it, more emotionally demanding, and especially in sectors like healthcare, where I do a lot of my research. So I think when systems are systems and when people are very stretched, people will feel and people will start to look around and say something is not right here. And we can see that already in things like high levels of burnout, work anxiety and distress and disengagement at work. So they're the symptoms that you see from a very sort of distressed system, I think. I also think COVID, though it feels like it was a very long time ago, it wasn't, but it was a huge accelerator, I think, of this type of research. So if we can sort of take a few, our memories back, we saw during the pandemic extraordinary acts of compassion in healthcare and other aspects of work as well. And I think at that point, people started to realize that, you know what, compassion isn't just a nice to have. It's actually a really critical thing for getting through crises together. And we saw that. And then what happened then was post-pandemic, and this is where we're sort of where we're at the moment, we're starting to see really the fallout and the cost of working in systems that didn't always support it. So it's now a sustainability issue around well-being and how much people have left in their tank, really. And finally, I'll just say another thing is that looking ahead, I think compassion research will continue to rise in its importance and its relevance. So when we think about the rapid adoption of AI as the thing that's happening, there are so many aspects of work. So thinking about the way work is changing at the moment, the way jobs are changing, so many aspects of work are being automated. So we see that in accounting and auditing. Accounting and auditing work, for example, where a lot of that is being automated and the AI does a better job. So we're sort of now tackling a new question, I'd say, which is, what remains uniquely human then at work? What are the human skills that we still need and is valuable? So I think AI can try to simulate empathy in the form of writing caring messages, and maybe in that way it's very good at it because it's very good with words. But we know that compassion isn't just words, right? It's inherently action orientated. So it's noticing suffering. Let's say the AI doesn't notice, it doesn't think, and feeling and being moved by suffering and wanting and taking action to alleviate. These are things that I don't think technology is capable of, and these are, I believe, innately human capabilities. So topics like compassion, I think, will just become more and more important.
Yeah, work is already difficult in a way, isn't it? We
Mm.
are stretched thin, and the resources are hard to come by, and time is of the essence. And so, in a sense, even at that fundamental level, compassion in and around the workplace is kind of essential. And then certain big global things happen, COVID and so on. And I remember Marcella Matos did a multinational kind of study and found that compassion did actually increase, around the world in response to that, because people were wanting to be helpful. But then how is that sustained,
Mm.
and is sort of a bit of a $60 million question. And then this question of AI is such a sort of, it's just looming there, isn't it? It feels like stuff is changing so rapidly, and what does it mean for our jobs and the massive changes that will come, and even from a compassion or empathy point of view, yes, the AI seems to try to simulate something which might not be exactly what we're talking about, but on the other hand, people are also using it in that way, which is
Yeah.
sort of an interesting thing about how they've adopted it. I must admit, whenever I talk to ChatGPT, it sort of says to me, "Oh, Stan, what a wonderful thought you've had! What a brilliant idea!" That sort of does all of this
It's very good at
sycophancy.
validating, isn't
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
yeah, but it's missing something, and I suppose yes, partly compassionate work is about maintaining the humanness, I guess, at work,
The human connection at work
human
as well.
connection.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of workplace compassion, or a lot of compassion research really is focused on individuals. And your work kind of pushes us to look a bit beyond that, I guess. But if we start with the individual stuff, like what do we miss maybe in the workplace if we're thinking, just about, compassion as something that the individual employee has or doesn't have?
Yeah, Stan, I actually think we miss a lot. And we also risk a lot, not just missing, because we're not able to, I think, realize the full potential of compassion when it's only sort of examined through the lens of the individual, because it's so much more and its impact is so much more when it extends beyond the individual to more collective domains, such as within teams or groups and organizations, communities, societies, and beyond. So I'll go back to health and I'll give an example. So when we focus on the individual level of compassion, we will tend to ask, is this nurse, doctor, whatever the health practitioner is this person compassionate enough? And when they're not being compassionate enough, the risk in this question is that it can make us blame the individual if it's seen through primarily a trait lens or an individual lens, let's say.
Hmm.
So, but we know that even the most compassionate clinician, we can't always act compassionate all the time. So if we think about ourselves or the work we do, we're running from patient to patient, then workload is the major issue there. It's not us not being able to be compassionate. So we have a paper on this where we found that the link between compassionate care behaviours and positive outcomes such as psychological safety is weakened when workload demands are high in that work context. So that's an example. I also think that because, and I go back again, that the work landscape and work has changed so much in the way work is structured. I mentioned it being flatter. There's greater reliance on teams in terms of teams and collaboration to get work done and get things done. I think that if work is being structured and designed so differently now, then it's really quite questionable as to whether situating compassion as an individual obligation is a practical thing to do, even a sustainable thing to do. I mean, it's not fitting with the context of the current work landscape. And I mentioned impact and that we're missing a lot because, yeah, so I just think compassion is so much more powerful and when it's enacted collectively. And that's why I do think we need to move beyond just the individual if we want to reach impact. Yeah.
And just popped to mind, I guess, for me is the same sort of applies to the notion of self-compassion or self-care, which gets talked about, and yet if that's just considered from an individual point of view, there seems like there might be dangers there too. You know, what are your thoughts about self-compassion at that individual level in the workplace?
Oh, I think self-compassion is a building block and it is a foundation of compassion. And I do think that, if you ask where do I start, and what is the role of self-compassion, I'd say it's a critical role. So I'd say you would start with looking at how you care for yourself. And we often say that it's not about caring in that sort of narcissistic way, is it? It's about actually having that non-judgmental way of thinking about yourself and really being kind in the way you think about yourself and the way you perceive and evaluate yourself as well. So I think there are very powerful benefits to starting at self-compassion, but we can move beyond. And I think when we have enough to give to ourselves, we'll be able to give to others. So I think it's a key role. It's just that it's a very multi-layered role, and I'll talk about that later as well.
Yeah. Yes, because I think sometimes the danger is if the onus is on the individual to kind of bring self-compassion and self-care to themselves, then the organization is less inclined to actually change the demands that are being placed on the person,
Yes,
and
that's
all of
right.
the responsibility can sometimes land on the individual. Um, so you've mentioned there compassion at the team level as sort of a kind of coordinated process, a sort of collective approach. But what would be a practical kind of example of what team compassion might actually look like, just to kind of get our head around it in that sort of day-to-day work?
Yeah, so the construct of team compassion is fairly new, Stan, I'd say, and there hasn't been that much research on team level compassion. Um, and we are starting to look at it. But at a very practical level, team compassion, I would say, looks like small, coordinated actions that's carried out by the team. So let me explain a bit more what I mean by that. So if you look at the way people work together in teams, so if you have a sort of if you're an observer of a team and you sort of stand away and look at them, you will notice and that there are certain shared practices and shared ways that the team members are working together. So these sort of behavioral norms that you'll see emerge that is compassionate or not so compassionate. And that's what I mean. So for example, uh, team members noticing, let's say, a colleague who is being, let's say, unusually quiet after a difficult patient interaction. This is small actions. And then someone checks in and say, "Are you okay? Would you like me to cover the next patient?" Let's say. Then the team adjusts that work demand or workload without any drama or judgment. So it's having some sort of a team process, and you'll see it. And that could be also team process for debriefing after certain critical events, making space and giving time, the team making space and giving time to show care for one another, the team slowing down actually when noticing something or someone or something doesn't feel right and then coming together. But I think the key thing about team compassion is that no one person is carrying it alone. Um, and that the team notices it, it feels, and it responds together. And that these practices or these shared practices, they are, as I mentioned, shared but legitimized. It's reinforced and it's valued and it's prioritized in the team. So it's more than just the individual. Yeah,
Mm.
that's how we've been looking at team
Yeah.
compassion.
Yes, there's the shared word. It seems important, and there's a kind of a reciprocal
Yes,
nature to it, and there might be different times when different people are on the giving or the receiving end or whatever, and we're able to be flexible, I suppose, as well, and kind of pivot, so to speak, when necessary to just create that team sense of support.
that's right. Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
that's what we really mean.
Yeah. You mentioned noticing,
Mm.
and I think in your research you've sort of looked at team mindfulness, playing an important role in enabling kind of team compassion. So what's the relationship there really between mindfulness and compassion in the team at the team level?
That's a complex question, Stan. The relationship, because look, I don't want to get all like academic, but it does depend a little bit on how we measure team mindfulness. So
Okay, yeah.
I'll say a little bit there. So we do have a paper where we aggregated individual mindfulness traits. So how mindful you are, how mindful I am, and and we work as a team. So and then we bring that up to the team level, and that's sort of an aggregated mindfulness of that team, just like if you were to look at how extroverted a team is, and you'll just get the extroversion of each team member and then average it up. So when we did that, we did find positive relationships. So teams that had more mindful members is how I would describe that way of measuring. So we found that teams with more mindful members did engage in more compassionate interactions with each other. And they also then reported greater team satisfaction. So they actually had greater enjoyment working together, which is important because that's around well-being, team viability, team sustainability, right? You can't work with people you don't like for a long time. So
Mm.
it was a nice finding. But colleagues have also looked at team mindfulness as a shared phenomenon, and that's measured slightly different. So that's not just measuring each person's trait mindfulness, but something that a bit more collective. And they've defined it more as when the team is aware and accepting of itself as a team. And it's very different to each team member, let's say, practicing meditation or mindfulness on their own, which is perhaps potentially the way that that paper that I mentioned, we looked at just the individual, but that and it's not that it's not important. The individual mindfulness is really important as well, but it's more about what the team does together and the shared awareness. So that collective noticing without judgment, the example I just gave as well. And this enables the team to be able to catch issues and problems much earlier. And they're able to respond a lot more quickly and often more compassionately as well, which is why mindfulness is an enabler of compassion to each other, but also to the people they serve, such as their clients or their patients. So there's a lot of positive outcomes when team mindfulness and compassion go hand in hand together in terms of the flow on effects to others.
Mm. Just sort of elaborate a bit more on the second, because I definitely understand that idea of the individual kind of levels of mindfulness
Mm.
across different team members and how that can kind of work towards compassion. So what? Because what really interested me there, you sort of almost said an awareness of the team in a way, or even an awareness of uh, kind of being a team almost.
Mm.
Was the impression I nearly got there. So, yeah, how was that team mindfulness sort of measured, or can you, yeah, just sort of give us a little bit
Mm.
more on that?
So there's a bit of an overlap, I think, between team mindfulness in that shared perspective to that shared mental model, which is a very well-established construct in the team literature. So when you see teams that have a shared mental model, they're just in sync. So all the members have a very good sense of the task, the workload, what needs to be done, where things are at, who needs backup, who needs support at any point in time. So there is this really good sense of what's going on in our team, who needs to do what when, and that is almost, so I would say there's a bit of a Venn diagram between team mindfulness that's being measured in that very shared way, that shared awareness way, with that construct that's more well established of shared mental models. And it's different ways to measure it, but you're trying to tap into a convergence that the team has about the way the team is functioning together. And there's a great sync in that. So synergy, there's a synergy where you see in aircraft and aviation crew, your teams, they just seem to know. And they're all like, if you look at a batch of ants as well, when they're working together, you seem to all know where to go and what to do. And it's just very well organized. And that's what they were talking about when they're saying that team mindfulness and that shared awareness of each other.
Yes. No, it's really interesting. The mindfulness, the team, the mental model, but also team mindfulness possibly promotes a number of really positive aspects to team functioning, but including, I guess, team compassion in a sense as
And I
well.
think of, Stan, I can't help but think of soccer, when you
I
look at,
was thinking of soccer
well,
myself.
yeah, and
Yeah,
like,
I was.
it's like you get a group of people together, right? And they're amazing as they are. So you want superstars and they're all in, but they all need to know how to work together. And when you're on the field and it's high pressure, and a lot of the environment that I work in is high stakes, high pressure, it's how they're able to notice what's going left, right, where the goal is, and just being able to pass the ball to each other and to support each other when needed to fill in the gap. So I think it's a great analogy. There's great team mindfulness when you look at a game like soccer, where no one individual can do it on their own. And I think that's a powerful thing. I don't think we've really done enough on sort of looking at that shared awareness.
Mm. And bringing into it, I guess, a shared awareness of suffering, I
Yeah.
suppose, is
Yeah.
perhaps the bit that
The
then
lens.
might,
Yes.
yeah, that then kind of take us towards compassion in a sense. Actually, it's just made me think, have you found that health practitioner or health teams are more or less team mindfulness or team compassion than other workplaces, or like the accountants or auditors that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, it's dangerous comparing across occupations, Stan. I haven't done that type of research myself. Um, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that. And I'm not sure if there has been research. I think it's an interesting one.
Mm.
But I'm not convinced actually necessarily that some occupations are, well, you would maybe in high stakes you have to as a function of what you're trying to do. So yeah, so I'll just leave it at that because I don't know.
Mm. Yes, no, that's very appropriate. It's a bit of one of those questions, but I guess I was just thinking that with the soccer team, but perhaps in an accounting firm, there are other motives at play. That there's the competitive motives, and sometimes there can be a sense of the other person on the team is someone you're also competing with,
Yep.
because you may or may not be picked next week, or you may or may not, you know, get the bonus this week because of so there's a competitive motive potentially that can make that shift to team compassion trickier, but yeah, maybe not, in fact,
No, I
actually,
think
yes.
you're onto something. And I was at a conference recently, actually at UQ, and we had a few colleagues present their research. And one of the colleagues was presenting work on a competitive organizational culture and what that does. And I think that's sort of similar to what you're saying. And indeed, that makes it really hard for people to enact sort of more citizenship, more empathetic behaviors, or more other orientated behaviors because the system and the culture is set up to not reward that type of behavior, let's say, or there's
Mm.
that added pressure to enact in a certain way. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, one of the striking things about your work is that compassion also isn't necessarily just linked to well-being. It actually is linked to outcomes of various sorts, and in the health sector, perhaps outcomes in even patient safety, or fewer errors. And so, what's the relationship there? Do you think? Why do you think compassion has such a tangible impact on performance as a
Mm-mm.
team and safety outcomes?
I think this is the most exciting bit of my research and the most impactful, actually being able to link compassionate behaviors, and in this case, compassionate care behaviors in healthcare, to more hard outcomes or bottom line outcomes, and particularly around patient safety and patient safety metrics, because that's when organisations really start to sit up and actually, show a lot of interest that this thing matters a lot. I think that compassion is able to have such tangible effects, as you were saying, because it is so action orientated, the construct. It is not just a feel or a notice, it is a doing. So I think its action orientation gives it the ability to change behavior in that very practical, tangible way. So I'll again, just to give you some examples, we know that there's a lot of evidence to show that that showing compassion makes people, and if you're interacting with patients and it's patients or your team members, feel much safer to speak up about their concerns. And there's a lot of good links there. And when people feel safer, what they do is they'll be able to tell you more about what really is going on. And also that would really help also them to prompt to seek help and continue to seek help as well. So I think when you're showing compassion with, like, let's say now to team members, like what I just said to you, perhaps even if a nurse or a junior doctor or someone saying, admitting like, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think that can, in some contexts, save lives, right? Because then others can actually jump in and be able to support that person, as opposed to feeling a lot of fear or shame to say that, which is dangerous, actually, particularly in the health context.
Yeah, that's really cool. The bit about action is really interesting, and it's often something that can be a misinterpretation around compassion, is that it is more of a feeling or something like that. But actually, it's a very action, taking steps, being helpful kind of
Mm.
a sort of a motivation, and so the action itself leads to changes that might create more safety. For example, even the early example of someone noticing that someone's kind of struggling coming out of a patient session and then offers to do the next one for them. You could imagine that would create a potentially a sort of an improved outcome, even just little bits by little
Even
bits,
little, yes, yes.
little incremental improvements. And then that person has a little kind of moment, they're able to kind of settle themselves and ground themselves, and then they go to the next person, and they're more able to have a really positive interaction, and so on as well. And so there's sort of the action piece, but then there's also the safeness piece as
Mm.
well. And it seems so important in the health kind of sector that we're able to speak our concerns or things that we've noticed, or something that often, if people aren't feeling very safe, they don't want to look silly. They don't want it to be sort of, humiliated by asking a question, and so they stay silent, and something gets missed. So the safeness piece, that creating of safeness is really interesting as well. Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, there's some good research, Stan, on looking at how GPs who are more compassionate and have more compassionate conversations with their patients are able to get more out of their patients about, the health challenges that they're having, and that leads to better treatment. Which is why you're getting these flow-on effects to better safety outcomes, because they're feeling safe to tell you, actually, this is what I did and this is what happened. And then you're like, okay, now we can find better solutions because I'm hearing you, and you feel safe to tell me what's going on. So
Mm.
there's some good links there, and even links to mortality rates. So it's an impressive literature looking at compassion and safety outcomes.
Mm. And it does make me wonder again about more the corporate world, or commercial sort of sectors, where it wouldn't surprise me at all if team compassion would be predictive of better outcomes there as well.
Mm.
Um, Not least the well-being kind of outcomes amongst the people or the individuals themselves, but actually just better performance in the role.
Mm.
So it would be really great to start to look at some of those other sectors as well, I suppose. But
Agree, 100%. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We sort of in the caring professions, that sort of doctors or nurses or psychologists, should just be compassionate.
Mm.
Even in really tough systems, they are often really tough environments, I suppose. And what are some of the real risks there, I guess, of placing the responsibility of compassion, and for that matter, of coping with all of that, like solely on individuals rather than the team, or actually perhaps even the organization?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this relates very much to what we've been discussing as well, where I spoke about how it's just not sustainable. That onus on individuals to carry the load and the burden of compassion. And I mentioned burnout. And so, indeed, that's one of the biggest challenges we have in the healthcare and social assistance. And we've been doing a lot of research looking at the number of psychological injury claims actually in the healthcare and social assistance, and it's triple the rate of any other industry. So, in fact, we have looked at some comparison across industries, Stan, actually, on that. And there's very
Yeah.
strong research there. But yeah, so when it's on the individual, I think, and you and I, we can reflect on this. I'm sure we've seen colleagues ourselves who have gone through this process of just feeling great shame and guilt and emotional exhaustion, feeling quite making errors at work because of all that. And what it's been doing, at least in absolute health and social assistance, is pushing people out of that profession, which is hugely problematic because we're now having major issues with workforce sustainability in the healthcare and social assistance, where people just don't want to be in professions that carry this individual burden. And if we as a society place that on carers, it's just we're not going to have a good outcome. And we need carers. That's the thing. We need people to be in hospitals. We need people to take care of our infants. We need people to care of our elderly and the most vulnerable people in our society. It's an absolutely critical workforce, but it's a workforce where, as I said, this traditional view of them having to carry the load of being compassionate is really tricky. Um, I think we need to recognize, and psychologists are very good at recognizing this, but not necessarily every other profession, that as individuals we have limited resources to cope. That is human. We only have a certain amount a day to give. So I think if I think we need systems that are designed better, organizations that are designed better, work and jobs that are designed better, leaders to support people to do good work. It can't just be left to the individual. And I think that's been sort of what we've been trying to keep pushing.
Mm. Yes, it makes me think there's sort of individual compassion, there's team compassion, and maybe there's organizational compassion or
There
something
has to be.
at that much broader systems level. And in the recent special issue that you edited or led, what's it called with the special issue that you're the special issue editor?
Editor in chief or something?
Yeah,
I
something
something
like that.
like something fancy like that, but it doesn't mean anything.
Oh, well, it was a great special issue, but yeah, it seemed that compassion can be sort of constrained by structures or policies or the culture of the broader organization. I mean, what would be some of the most common organizational barriers that might get in the way of individual or team compassion at work?
Yeah, it's an excellent special issue, and there's an excellent paper actually in the special issue by Mia Parkinen and colleagues from the University of Helsinki, and that paper was very much focused on the organizational level, and I loved it because it interviewed managers and employees from a variety of different organizations, not just healthcare, and they identified 5 key organizational barriers. They're called organizational barriers, but I'll just summarize what the 5 barriers are. The first is mindset, which is an individual barrier, but it's about intersections and interrelationships. I'll go there. But with mindset, it's about, am I even aware? These are some of the questions that sit within the mindset. Some people are not even aware. Do I even care? compassion might not even be on their minds, and they're not even thinking about it necessarily, or thinking that it's a valuable thing, or so there's a mindset challenge. Then they've mentioned behavior, and this is more about people reflecting on, do I have what it takes to action? So that's more, or to carry through the behavior. Then they've got culture, and that's sort of more like, is there permission within that culture to raise these issues or to bring these challenges up? And then they speak about system as the fourth barrier. So are the systems and the processes, do they support well-being and compassion, or are they geared more towards, let's say, efficiency or profitability or competitiveness, let's say? And then finally, leadership, which is, do the leaders care? What is it that they value? Is compassion at the forefront of their values, let's say? And these barriers, you could see mindset and behaviors and cultures, they're a mix of individual and communal factors, and they're also a mix of internal and external. So sort of there's a quadrant that the paper speaks about. But what I particularly love about this paper is that it's not just looking at the barriers in their siloed layers, right? Which is often what we tend to do. We look at individual teams or whatever it is, but actually looking at the way that these different layers interrelate and are interconnected as part of more complex systems. And so instead of saying the shortcoming is to do with the individual, or the problem is to do with the team, or it's the institutional fault, such as culture, they're saying that it is about the way that these layers influence each other at different levels. So there's knock-on effects as well. It's a very complex paper, but it does call for what they've called for more systems intelligence thinking, which is a systems-driven way of thinking. And it's about embracing more the complexity of work, I think, and the need to think about the entanglements, I think, to develop better solutions. So I tend to see it in layers that are siloed. They've gone up and down across the different layers and said, look, these things all are interconnected, and you can't unpick one without, or you can't uproot one barrier without addressing the others. And I think it's a very intelligent way of thinking about compassion.
Because really, an organisation kind of is just a whole lot of people, I suppose, in all different roles and all different levels and layers, and with various motives at play that they're trying to juggle, and quite often there might be threat system or drive system at play, even for people at different levels, that can make it hard. But it's the interplay amongst all of that is sort of, well, it's complex, but also that's where we need to try to address. It's not as simple as saying, well, the leader should be, leading the way and be more compassionate, and it's not really to say, well, I've come here and it's just the culture the
Yes.
culture's not,
Yeah.
it's all these sort of multi factors that, what I mean, how do we address that? That's probably a complicated question as well.
How do we address that? I think that's a nut we haven't cracked yet, Stan. But there are a lot of, maybe we'll talk more about what do we do, and where do we go from here, in a sense, from a strategy point of view. And so I'm an optimist, and I'll just declare that, and I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I'm hopeful. So we spoke about just now how complex it is and how embedded things are, and I think in some way that's a good thing. So I'm going to lean into this interconnection and the fact that it is complex, because what it means is that even small change and small gestures and small things can have great impact. So these things are all interconnected, as you were saying. The leaders embeds in the culture is part of an organization, and then within all that, there's mindsets, mindsets traveling through all of it. You can see it. Then I think we lean into that and say, well, what can we do? We can do a lot. So for managers and leaders, and reflecting on this, and I work a lot with managers and leaders, I mentioned starting with the self, And I still believe that. I think that's an important place to start. To look in the mirror often, and that's about mindset and self-awareness and social awareness, and where is your view on this as a leader, and how are you also thinking about compassion for yourself? And I think we mentioned a little bit of self-compassion. You're also your individual mindfulness, thinking about mindfulness, because we know that these two are very, very related, and one enables the other. Developing your own emotional intelligence. I think this is all around the interpersonal skills. This is all within that domain. And I think what's really also important is engaging in what I call collective learning or mutual learning. And that is about having, I'd say, dialogue and learning from each other. And one of the key things that I've noticed more and more is being able to have difficult conversations. That's a big one, I think. And the leaders and managers' role to be able to navigate difficult conversations well, and equipping them with the skills to be able to do this well. Because, as you were saying, at the heart of compassion, it's all about facing pain. It is about suffering. It's about acknowledging and noticing suffering, instead of walking past it, which is easy to do, I guess. But we need to have the skills. I think we need to equip our leaders and managers and our teams to be able to have the skills to manage these more difficult conversations, as opposed to just saying, yeah, you go do it. So yeah, I'd say, I think I've gone on a bit of a tangent there, Stan, but
No, that's
I'll
right.
stop
I
there.
think what I'm getting from you is that the beauty of the complexity in a way is that there's many ways in.
Yes.
Therefore, yeah, and there's the individual sort of intrapersonal aspect to it. The we might start in and around mindfulness and self-compassion and mindset and emotional intelligence and those sort of things. That's very worthy and worth doing. But then there's the interpersonal piece, which
In-
is how to relate to one another, and that might be sort of people at our own level or people sort of at different levels, and creating that interpersonal piece, even a sort of a sense of the group or the communal kind of, there's a kind of an awareness around that, the team mindfulness and the team compassion that we can start to bring into that as well. And it's about skills by the sounds of it. It's skills, not least communication skills, but we might be trying to work with leaders in certain ways, but with team members in certain ways, and there's just sort of many ways in, and it's probably a work in progress, and sort of change, especially at that cultural organizational level, might just kind of move along kind of in its own at its own pace. But yes, it's actually possible because there are all of these identified aspects to it.
Yeah. And yesterday I was doing a workshop with leaders, and
Mm,
we were looking at, and I mentioned circles of control because I think there are so many ways to, there are so many actions and so many things that can be done, but where do you start in a way? And you think about it, it could be quite overwhelming, given that these are wicked problems that we're talking about. They're not simple solution problems. So yeah, when I think of those, when I think of, what can we control directly, these are absolutely our own behaviors and how we signal and what we're signaling and how we're modeling to others around us, because someone's watching and noticing, and these are norms, and we start to create what we think is acceptable, what is not. So the inner circle, I think, is where we can control the most. And then obviously there are things that we can try and influence as leaders and as managers, and that is around having these difficult conversations. You know, when you nail a difficult conversation, your circle of influence increases, it expands out a bit more. You become more interpersonally confident as well. You expand on your skills. And then there are things that are in our circle of sort of concern. They're important and they impact us, but that we don't have direct control or influence. And most of it, sometimes we can get quite overwhelmed when we just sort of try and focus all our attention on the things that we're concerned about, but don't have direct control. So I think it's about thinking through what we can do quite immediately to help ourselves in terms of our own well-being and those of others. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Does psychological flexibility come into that? Has that been kind of looked at, that ability to sort of have a strong intention on what one might be trying to achieve, but not hold too tightly onto the outcome, or sort of, and being able to move and shift and pivot when necessary.
Absolutely, I think. And given that, the world that we live in now is just so volatile and fragmented, and things are changing so rapidly, I think that ability to think a bit more, to have that more flexibility in the way we cope and deal with change. We did measure psychological flexibility in one study, looking at nurse patient dyads. And there we actually conceptualized psychological flexibility in two ways, Stan. We looked at it in the form of mindfulness, because that helps, that is part of that, being able to be more psychologically flexible, and what we've called values-driven action, which is the way, just being able to be values-driven in our decisions and our thoughts and how we behave. So it's absolutely relevant as well.
Mm. Well, the special issue is really great to dive into. It's got a lot of excellent papers in there. I'll have the link to all of that in the description. It's the Australian Journal of Management, which is cool, and Compassion at Work, I think, is the special edition. So yeah, but and I'm sure that was an accomplishment that you then had to kind of recover from. But what's happening next for you? I mean,
Oh.
where are you? Where's your thinking taking you in terms of this compassion at work kind of idea?
Yeah, I think where everything we spoke about, I'm keen to keep moving forward. So really pushing the field to go beyond the individual.
Yeah.
And I think that the team is a great start, because it is often people's most salient contexts at work. The organization can sometimes feel quite removed, especially if you work in a very big organization, but your team and your team member has a very strong impact on your everyday well-being. And so I think team compassion deserves a lot more work, and that would be something I'd focus on. But I think this more systems-driven thinking way of thinking about compassion in that more sort of complex is something that I think needs more research. I think that's where the research on compassion is heading, that sort of notion of compassionate organizing, which is an organizational level way of thinking about compassion, just what you mentioned. How are organizations designed and organized to actually prioritize compassion and compassionate interactions that works. So we have now compassionate leave, for example, in our policy. So that is a policy-driven example of compassionate organizing, and something we shouldn't take for granted, because we didn't have such a leave a while back. Um, and I think really, yeah, just moving away from the more traditional heroic view of the individual. I work with a lot of nursing colleagues, and they often say, the traditional view of nurses is sort of the white angel that comes floating through and really resolves and helps everyone. And that's really not a sustainable view of compassion. And really I'd like to see compassion research as something that we know more about in terms of how we build and enact compassion together. So that more collective sense.
Mm.
Hopefully
Yes,
we get there.
we're just getting back to the humanity of it all, isn't it? And
Yeah.
this it is that I find that really interesting, that notion of kind of moving away from the heroic, because yes, it sort of becomes a sort of martyring
Yes.
sort of experience in some
Yeah.
ways, and really coming back to the humanity of each person, the humanity of the team, the organization, and so
Yeah, the
on.
notion
Well,
of vulnerability actually, Stan. Like I
mm,
think there's not been a lot of research on vulnerability as well. And I think even the word suffering feels odd in the corporate context. Like because I obviously publish more in the management space and in the business school sort of papers that they sort of react to this when we talk about compassion to suffering as if it doesn't belong in workplaces. I think that's so odd because when I look at workplaces, I see suffering all around us in different forms. So I think we're still a long way, if I can be honest, in the business world to really start to normalize what human experiences.
yes, yeah. Yes, and I will let you go in a moment because I know you we need to finish up. But yes, the way of the world at the moment is just sort of even intrudes really. There's so much. I've just come this morning off doing a webinar about working with grief and with compassion and so on, and there is a lot of grief and loss around us at the moment in terms of how the world is changing, and that comes into all facets of our life and work, in as well as our personal life. So we're the same person whether we're at home or at work. And now sometimes we're at home when we work, and that makes
Mhm.
it kind of complicated as well.
Yeah. And let's not forget compassion for our environment. So there's so many layers of compassion that we sort of haven't tapped into at all. So
Mm,
it goes well beyond us. And I think this has been the major theme of this sort of conversation, isn't it?
yeah. Well, Professor Helena Nguyen, thank you. Well, thanks for the work that you do, and you presented at the UQ Compassion Symposium last year, which was really wonderful, and kind of clued me into the special issue and all the rest of it. So that's thanks for all of that great work, but also thank you for speaking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Thanks for having me, Stan.
Good. All right, I'll just
All
press
right.
stop.